Hey everybody, this first little tutorial or little overview is just going to be how to kind of organize your project in Unity and some of the kind of tips and tricks that we use to make our project make a little bit more sense and not get super confusing. So let's just create ourselves a little cube here. So we got a cube, it's pretty sweet. So this is, this is the beginning of our asset, uh, placement for our project. We start making some stuff. Well, eventually you're gonna get a lot of different assets. You're gonna get you start placing trees or different things, and your hierarchy over here is gonna get really confusing. It's just gonna have a ton of objects. You're just gonna have lists of things and all that, and not really a good way to work. Just to kind of leave it on its own. Primarily because if anybody else has to open your file, it'll get confusing, and even for yourself, just trying to organize through the stuff, especially once your list gets to the bottom of this and you have to scroll and try and find your stuff. It's pretty crazy. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is just naming conventions. Really take the time to name all your stuff. I really like to name my things. If I'm going to call my tree, let's say I have a bunch of trees, I'm going to call my tree and then large underscore _01. And then if I had small trees, I would call them tree underscore SML _01. Now the reason I do that is to make sure that the word tree is together. So when I'm searching them in alphabetical order, I get all my trees together and then it sorts by size. If you put large tree, small tree, then the L's would be with the L's, the S's will be with the S's, even though they're all trees. It gets very confusing. So that's number one. Just make sure you name your stuff. Number two is to actually organize this hierarchy. Unfortunately, Unity doesn't have any built-in folder structure features, so we kind of have to do it in a dumb way. We have to use game objects to kind of organize our stuff. Now, the way to do that is to go into game object up here and go to create empty. And all that's going to do is create a game object that has nothing in it. It's just like a blank pivot. Now, we can use these as folders, but before we do that, you'll notice that when this thing was created, over here in the inspector, already had a value for my position. Now, you have to make sure that all your folders are set to 000 across the board and with a scale of 1. The reason is, let me show you the difference. So let's say I have one game object here and another one that I've zeroed out. You can zero by clicking the little gear here and hitting reset. If I take my cube and I throw it into game object number 1, you'll see here that if you pay attention before I put it in, it's at 0.75. Actually, let's just zero him out. Right, so he's all 000. If I put him into the first game object, he gets values associated with him. But if I put him in the second game object, he stays at 000. Now the reason for that is any child of a game object, a child is anything you link into a game object like that, will inherit any of the values of that parent game object. Now, when you're using things as folders, you want to keep all basically your math as simple as you can. So you want everything to start from 000 with no, doesn't have to add any numbers, anything to the rotation or position. So then all your objects are nice and clean. So typically what we'll do is we'll make an empty game object. We'll click this little gear here and hit reset. Then we'll name this something generic like a folder. So this one just could be called trees. And now that I have a tree folder, I can take all of my different trees that I've made and simply just click and drag them into my tree folder. And now that we have a tree folder or a different game object, we'll get this little triangle over on the side here. You can click it and kind of close that hierarchy. So you can imagine if we started having a million trees like this, right? And you have to scroll through just this whole folder just to get to whatever's next in your list. Well, you can just close it down, and now your hierarchy looks nice and clean. So that's just the first little bit I wanted to talk about. Just organizing your stuff into folders, naming things properly. It's going to save you a lot of headaches in the future, especially on bigger projects that you'll be working on, like your environment class or your side scrollers or your capstone. So try and keep that in mind as best as you can. And I know it does take time to name things and organize them and all that, but it's worth it. It's worth spending the extra few seconds right now when things make sense. Than sometimes hours trying to dig through different objects and try to figure out what's what. So keep that in mind. And then the last thing about these objects, which is really nice, let's say we had these millions of trees, which they're all just kind of on top of each other right now. If you had a whole forest of trees and they're all nicely grouped into this game object and you wanted to hide them all, well, you wouldn't have to select all the different trees in your scene. You could just select this game object, this folder, and up in the inspector, you could just take off that little checkbox and it'll just hide all the trees. So if you had bushes or grass or rocks and things like that, you could just hide them all one by one. If the editor's running slow or if you're just having trouble seeing, it's a nice way to go about and do that. So, so yeah, keep that in mind. And that's it for organization.